Hello, everyone. This is a revision or exam booster session looking specifically at the advantages and disadvantages of monopolies and growing monopoly power. We're going to look at in this session the build-up of what we call the perfect paragraph in economics. So for each of the advantages and disadvantages, it's talked through in a way that would correspond with the idea of the perfect paragraph for AQA economics. When you do get questions on monopolies in your exam, sometimes they may ask you direct, what are the benefits and the drawbacks of monopolies, but sometimes they may use other phrases, for example, the desirability of monopolies. Are they desirable? Are they undesirable? Often when they say growing monopoly power, what the examiners are looking for is your ability to evaluate the idea of a monopoly market structure. So look at that difference between monopolies versus monopoly power and look at pros, cons, advantages, disadvantages, desirable and undesirable in the same context. So when we look at the idea of the perfect paragraph, what do we mean? It's a 5-step stage. The first thing you do is you make your point. You make your point within the first sentence. Now, what I've done in this presentation is at the top of every slide, I've actually given you as clear as day what the actual point is, what the actual advantage or what the actual disadvantage is. Using the wording of the question, you would then build in that advantage, link it with the context of the question, and make your point within the first sentence. An advantage of a monopoly or growing monopoly power to XYZ industry would be followed then by your advantage or disadvantage. You then need to explain how the theory works. Explain why it's an advantage, why it's a disadvantage. Talk about how this advantage or disadvantage is brought about using the elements of theory. What is the consequences? Particularly in this topic, we'll look at the consequences to the consumer, the consequences to society, the consequences to the firm and to the government. Look at examples and evidence, use the context, look at the industry that the examiners are giving you and use your common knowledge, use your common sense to apply theory to that industry. Evaluate, challenge the theory and think about maybe possible unintended consequences. And we'll look at that for every advantage and disadvantage that we go through in this presentation. For every paragraph or every point that you give, you must evaluate throughout the essay. In order to get one of the top levels between 20 to 25 in marks in your 25-mark essay question, you have to show a final conclusion, but you have to show the ability to evaluate throughout. So let's move straight into our first advantage. Now, what I would say as a word of warning when you're going through this presentation is please do not look at this as a standalone presentation. There are other videos showing you how to draw these diagrams, and I would encourage you to use your topic booklets that are given to you in lessons, your work booklets that you work through whenever we are in taught lessons. So this should be used alongside your topic work booklet. One of the first advantages of a monopoly is that the monopoly is said to be dynamically efficient. Now, what I've done here is I've given you the diagram for, as you will know, or you should be able to recognize at this stage, the monopoly firm making supernormal profits. So in order for a monopoly firm to be dynamically efficient, they first and foremost must be making supernormal profits. Dynamic efficiency is the reinvestment of those supernormal profits into things like innovation, research and development, improving the quality of the good or service. That's all well and good, but in order for a firm to engage in that, they must be making supernormal profits. The beauty of a monopoly is that they are able to make supernormal profits in both the short run and the long run. Now, this is unlike firms, for example, in perfect competition. Remember, in perfect competition, firms can only make supernormal profits in the short run. They cannot sustain them in the long run due to those high barriers to entry. But in monopoly firms, because of the high barriers to entry, they are able to sustain those supernormal profits. In perfect competition, there are low barriers to entry. It's easy for new firms to come in and compete away those supernormal profits. In a monopoly, barriers to entry are high. There's imperfect knowledge, legal barriers to entry, patents, copyrights, for example. This prevents new firms from entering the industry. It gives us a situation in which there is only, in its most extreme case, one firm in the industry. No firms, even though they have an incentive to enter the industry, it is very difficult, almost near impossible to do so due to the power of there being only one large firm. So it's important that you know that diagram before you go on then to looking at the wider theory of dynamic efficiency. So if we look at developing the perfect paragraph and the analysis around this diagram, my advice would be, as soon as you make your point about monopolies being dynamically efficient, I would then go ahead on the left-hand side and draw your diagram showing a monopoly firm making supernormal profits, because that's where we start this logical chain of analysis. Monopolies make and sustain supernormal profits in the long run, so they can make them in both the short run and the long run, due to the nature of the market structure. This profit can then be reinvested back into the company in the form of technological advances, technological change, technological progress, for example, invention, innovation into new products, research and development. Think about things like car manufacturing. As soon as a new car hits the market, a team of people working in research and development are engaging in procedures that will help them to come up with the next best car. So what's the next car going to look like? Mobile phones, for example, we're constantly innovating with mobile phones to come up with new, bigger and better ways of doing things. The reinvestment of these supernormal profits into dynamic efficiency brings with it a number of benefits for consumers. The consumer could receive a brand new product or better quality product over time. They may even be able to purchase products that never existed before. This will increase their welfare. It'll improve or increase their utility and overall satisfaction. Consumers develop greater levels of happiness and welfare from the creation of these new products, but also the development of existing products, the improvement in the quality of goods and services produced by the monopoly firm. Consumers subsequently then get better value for money, ceteris paribus, assuming that all other things held equal, assuming that firms do not increase the prices of their goods following an improvement in its quality. If technological advances are used to improve the production process, then this in turn could lead to reduced average unit costs. So don't be afraid to look at technological change from 2 points of view. Remember, you will remember it from lessons when we looked at it, that technological change can both improve the products that consumers get, but also the production processes that are used in order to make those goods and services. So if a firm does engage in technological advances into the production process, this could lead to reduced average unit costs. These cost savings could then be passed on to consumers in the form of lower prices. So if the firm does benefit from reduced average costs, monopoly firms are in a position where they could financially pass on these cost savings to consumers. They are able to lower their prices and make goods cheaper for consumers. Now, consumers get even greater value for money if the quality of the good increases and price decreases. Consumers subsequently, as a result of all of this, have greater choice. They've got greater access to either more goods and services or better quality goods and services. They benefit from what we call positive spillover effects of innovation. There's positive externalities associated with dynamic efficiency and associated with the investment of supernormal profits into research and development. Once firms have engaged in technological change and technological progress, they can look at implementing either a patent or a copyright on a product to help maintain their monopoly power in the long run. And as you'll remember, patents and copyrights act as a legal barrier to entry. So by being dynamically efficient, it benefits the consumer, but it also benefits the firm in being able to maintain those barriers to entry. So that's all well and good, but what are some of the evaluation points of dynamic efficiency? Have a think about what would be the unintended consequences of dynamic efficiencies. Let's now challenge the reliability of this theory. So it's all well and good firms reinvesting into supernormal profits into dynamic efficiency. However, let's look at it. There is no guarantee that this profit will be used for reinvestment, and thus dynamic efficiency may not actually occur. Now, there's no guarantee that profit will be reinvested because there is a lack of competition. In its most extreme case, in a pure monopoly, where the firm owns 100% of the market share, or the industry, where the firm is the industry, there is no competition. So therefore, there is no incentive. There is no incentive for these monopoly firms to reinvest these profits into becoming dynamically efficient. Why would you try and make your product even better when there is no close substitutes in the industry? If you don't do it, your consumers are not going to go elsewhere. They're not going to switch. They're not going to leave you and go to a competitor because there is no competition. So there's no guarantee because there's no incentive. Firms are actually, what are they more likely to do? They're more likely to pass on their profits to shareholders in the form of dividends. It would almost be seen as irrational to invest in dynamic efficiency. In the long run, firms may actually increase their prices further to justify better quality goods and services. So the unintended consequences of dynamic efficiency could actually be firms could turn around and say, we have improved the quality of our good or service, and therefore you as the consumer, you must pay for this improvement in quality. And to summarize then, in reality, it is argued that it is actually irrational for a firm to be dynamically efficient. They're more likely to want to pass that on to profit-seeking shareholders who are simply out to invest in a company to maximize their returns, to maximize their dividends. Shareholders are acting in their own self-interests, and they want the firm to work for them, not necessarily the customer. Our second advantage, monopolies can benefit from greater economies of scale. Now, I've shown you a slightly different diagram here than the traditional economies of scale diagram. You could draw the standard U-shaped ATC curve, but this is a much better, a slightly different diagram than what you'd be used to, but it's a much better diagram because it's economies of scale specifically applied to a monopoly versus a competitive market structure. So, first of all, we start our logical chain of analysis. Monopolies are able to exploit greater economies of scale than smaller competitive firms. So larger firms benefit from larger economies of scale. You could even add in here to beef up your analysis that the monopoly benefits from greater minimum efficient scale. They benefit from greater constant returns to scale. Remember that in a competitive market, there is a large number of small firms. And as a result of these large number of small firms, each firm is small relative to the size of the total market. And therefore, each firm will only produce a small amount of output in that market. Therefore, their economies of scale is going to be relatively small in comparison to that of larger companies. Larger companies benefit from greater economies of scale. Due to the size of the firm and the dominance of the monopoly in the market, the firm is able to spread their costs over a larger range of output. Now, that's further analysis onto the idea of economies of scale. What do we mean by economies of scale? We mean it by spreading costs over a larger range of output. It's a situation in which, as output increases, average costs per unit begin to decrease. Firms benefit from a range of economies of scale, such as technical, managerial, purchasing, and financial economies of scale. If you ever mention economies of scale in a exam question or in your answers, be it a 50-mark question or a 25-mark essay question or a 9-mark question, give examples of different types of economies of scale. And again, my advice would be look at the context that's been given to you and see if you can apply a particular type of economies of scale that you might think would match that particular type of industry. So let's have a look at this diagram. You know it's a diagram for a monopoly market structure because the firm is facing a downward sloping demand curve. AR is equal to D, which is also equal to price, and MR is falling at twice the rate of AR. I've given you two marginal cost curves here. The first marginal cost, as you can see here, the larger tick-shaped MC curve is for a monopoly. The smaller MC curve is above the monopoly MC curve, and that would be for a competitive market. Remember that in a competitive market, the firm achieves as much smaller economies of scale. Therefore, their costs per unit are going to be larger than that of a monopoly. The monopoly is able to spread their costs over a larger range of output. What I've done here to show you the difference in costs is if I go to Q1 and P1, you'll note here that where Q1 intersects marginal cost, it's where MR equals MC. So this is the price and output level for a profit maximizing monopolist. So if the monopoly firm operates at the profit maximizing level of output, where MR equals MC, their prices will be at P1. If the firm was in a competitive market, say for example, in a monopolistically competitive market, which is a market structure in which, similar to perfect competition, there is a large number of small firms, but there's a slight degree of differentiation. Therefore, the firm is able to have some degree of monopoly power and some degree of product differentiation. Because their economies of scale are much less, it means their marginal costs will be higher, and therefore, where MR equals MC at Q2, you'll note that output is less, but prices are higher, okay? So think about marginal cost, the addition to costs as a result of producing one more unit of a good. The larger the firm, the lower the average costs, therefore the lower the marginal costs, okay? So that diagram would be a much better one to draw. Do take time to study it and think about how you could include it in your answer. As a result of economies of scale, the monopolist is able to set lower prices. In the diagram, I'll make reference to P1, but also produce at a larger range of output. Again, being able to cater for greater levels of consumer demand. This will have a positive impact and benefits to society. More consumers have access to the good at a lower price. So it increases social welfare, it increases satisfaction, it increases utility. Evaluation then of economies of scale. So in order to be productively efficient, the firm must forego the objective of profit maximization. So if we look at the idea of the firm achieving economies of scale, we have to look at, there's a difference between working towards achieving economies of scale and being productively efficient. So the firm can exploit economies of scale, but in reality, the monopoly firm is likely to be productively inefficient. They're not operating at the lowest point of the ATC curve. Firms can still make profit if they are productively efficient, but will not make as much than if they were to operate where MR equals MC, okay? So even though the firm is productively inefficient, they're still making profits, they're still maximizing profits. If the firm was to be productively efficient, they would still make supernormal profits, but they wouldn't make anywhere near as much than what they would have if they were being a profit maximizer. Firms are unlikely to pass on these cost savings in the form of lower prices to the consumer. They are much more likely to increase their profits and pass this on to shareholders in the form of higher dividends. Okay, so in our analysis, we talked about the greater economies of scale, it leads to a lower average costs. Therefore, the firm is able to pass on lower costs in the form of lower prices. However, you have to ask yourself the question of, just because the firm is able financially to do it, are they necessarily willing to want to do it? What would their objectives be? It's likely to be profit maximization, and it's likely to be looking after the returns for shareholders in the form of higher dividends. In reality, due to the size of the monopoly firm, there is a risk they could actually experience diseconomies of scale. So because monopolies are a situation in which there is, in its most extreme case, one very large firm in which the firm is the industry. Due to the size of the firm, it's more likely that they become very difficult to manage. It becomes very difficult to control the costs of these firms, and they're actually likely to be very inefficient and likely to be experiencing some element of diseconomies of scale, particularly organizations which are poorly run. And lastly, there is no incentive to be productively efficient due to the lack of competition. So firms are not necessarily working hard to look at ways that they could introduce an ability to lower their prices. There's no incentive to do that. There's no incentive to be productively efficient because there is a lack of competition. Who cares if they lower their costs? Consumers would be beneficial. It would be beneficial for consumers. Consumers would be grateful for this lower price, but the firms don't have to keep up with other firms. Let's now move on to looking at disadvantages. So let's look at disadvantage one. One of the main disadvantages of a monopoly is that they're allocatively inefficient. And I've given you here another diagram that shows the firm operating at an allocatively inefficient level of output versus operating at the allocatively efficient level of output. So if you look here, QC on the diagram, PC, is the price if the firm was operating at the allocatively efficient level of output. Often when we say where P equals MC or where demand equals supply. Whereas QM is the output level if the firm was achieving profit maximization. Monopolies set high prices and restrict output away from the socially optimum level of output. They're allocatively inefficient. So they're setting a QM rather than QC on the diagram. They're not producing at a level that is deemed to be the socially optimum level by society. By setting high prices, they risk exploiting consumers and abusing their monopoly power. Remember that monopolies have the ability to set prices. Monopoly power is the ability of a firm to act as a price maker rather than as a price setter. Rather than act as a price taker. The monopoly firm is likely to exploit consumers. They're likely to abuse their monopoly power, certainly in the long run. The monopolist will set prices where MR is equal to MC, the profit maximizing objective, not where P equals MC. Good students will show on the diagram the differences in both price and output. At Q2, resources are not allocated according to consumer demand, with consumers getting lower quality than they desire. Supply is simply not equal to the demand of the good or service. Due to high prices, consumer choice is therefore restricted. This reduces the consumer surplus in the market. This therefore creates a deadweight loss or a welfare loss for society, and that's shown by the blue area, the triangular area on the diagram. There is a misallocation of resources, which therefore leads to market failure. And then, of course, in your final valuation, you would talk about possibly how market failure, we therefore need some form of government intervention to address this market failure. There is a risk then of creating inequality. Those on low incomes are potentially excluded from the market. It creates this inequality. If we set higher prices, we exclude those on from low income households who are therefore unable to purchase the good. They're pushed out of the market. They're excluded from the market because of an inability to pay for this good. Evaluation then of allocative inefficiency. So this is where it starts to get slightly tricky, for there's a conflict of objectives here. In order for the firm to be allocatively efficient, they will have to forgo the objective of profit maximization. So what I'm saying here is you can't do both. You can't profit maximize and be allocatively efficient at the same time in a monopoly. You have to, there's a trade-off here. If you go for the objective of profit maximization, you forgo being allocatively efficient. If you go for the objective of being allocatively efficient, you forgo the objective of being a profit maximizer. So you cannot achieve the best of both worlds. This may reduce their ability to be dynamically efficient. So if the firm did choose to be allocatively efficient, it means that there's less supernormal profits And therefore, because of the lack of supernormal profits, firms then may not be financially able to reinvest into research and development, innovation, and being dynamically efficient. There is a conflict of objectives here. The firm cannot achieve both, and so are more likely to pursue profit maximization to meet the needs of shareholders at the expense of consumers and society. Consumers may see a reduction in quality if prices are lowered. So if the firm does lower their prices in order to be allocatively efficient, that might come at an expense. The expense being a reduction in the quality of the good. So in order to eradicate that welfare loss and eradicate that market failure, the unintended consequences are that we would have to forego dynamic efficiency, that we would experience possibly a reduction in the quality of the good. Second disadvantage is that monopolies are productively inefficient. Whilst monopolies do benefit from increased economies of scale, they are still productively inefficient. They do not operate at the lowest point of the ATC curve, where ATC is equal to marginal cost. As most firms pursue the objective of profit maximization, they deliberately forego some economies of scale. They do not fully exploit the economies of scale available to them. So if you look at the diagram, if you follow up the dashed line where MR equals MC, you're operating to the left of the ATC curve. You're experiencing economies of scale, but you are not fully exploiting economies of scale. The firm is not producing at the lowest point of the ATC curve. They could lower its average costs further and subsequently produce more output at a reduced cost. So there is capacity there for the firm to produce at a lower cost. However, if the firm aims to profit maximize, they will forego the ability to be productively efficient. There is an opportunity cost here. Consequently, consumers will suffer from having to pay higher prices, lower consumer surplus. Okay, so the firm is productively inefficient. Therefore, they're not fully experiencing a situation in which average costs are at their lowest. And if average costs are not at their lowest, that means it's costing the firm more to produce the good, and therefore it is likely that prices will have to be higher to cover the costs of production. There is no incentive to be productively efficient as there is a lack of competition. Firms don't need to worry about making sure they've got the latest technology that will allow them to produce the largest amount of goods at the lowest possible average costs. Because remember, in monopoly, there is only one firm in its most extreme case. Mono in Greek means one. Very simply then, evaluation of productive efficiency. Even though they're productively inefficient, the firm is still exploiting economies of scale. Remember, it's better to be productively inefficient, but still experience economies of scale rather than experience diseconomies of scale. They are just not yet operating at the lowest point of the ATC curve. Again, there is a conflict of objectives. If the firm pursues productive efficiency, they will have to forego other objectives. They will have to forego profit maximization. They will have to forego dynamic efficiency. So again, simply evaluate productive inefficiency by, well, if they were to be productively efficient, what then is the unintended consequences? They have to forego other possible objectives. The third disadvantage, something we haven't really discussed much of, but it's in your notebooks. Monopolies can be what's said to be X-inefficient, and they may suffer from diseconomies of scale. So what does X-inefficiency mean? Due to the lack of competition, they often become complacent or they become lazy in their production process. This in turn creates unnecessary waste to occur, costs in excess of average costs. So because there's no competition, there's no incentive to be efficient, firms may experience lazier workers, or they may be implementing production processes that are not the most efficient processes out there. There's bigger and better ways that they could be doing it, but because there's no incentive to keep up with competition, or because there's no fear of new firms entering the market because of the high barriers to entry, firms do often become complacent. They become outdated and they simply accept the status quo. The firm is not producing goods in the most efficient way possible, using the resources that are available to them. As a consequence, consumers are forced to pay higher prices to cover the wastage and costs. So firms every year, they're wasting a significant amount of money. They're spending money on high levels of costs because as a result of that, consumers are forced into paying higher prices. The desire to be productively efficient seems tedious and may involve workers and managers changing their work habits or learning more efficient ways of production. And often in larger organizations, workers often experience an inertia to change, a reluctantness to want to change, and a reluctantness to want to do things differently because the new way might be deemed to be more efficient. This is considered unnecessary due to the lack of competition. There is no incentive or desire to be efficient, even when pursuing a strict profit maximizing objective. Now, often as students will get confused here because even though the objective is to be a profit maximizer, you can profit maximize, but at the same time, you still can be inefficient. Okay, the firm's main objective will be to do whatever they can to maximize their profits. And even if that means being slightly inefficient, then so be it. If shareholders are maximizing their dividends, they will turn a blind eye to the odd elements of inefficiencies now and again. Monopolies may also be experiencing diseconomies of scale simply because they become too large. Larger organizations will be realistic about the challenges of running those organizations. They will know themselves the challenges of running a large firm. And larger firms tend to be more inefficient. They become very difficult to manage and control. This will take place when average costs are rising as output continues to rise. So it's an upward movement of the ATC curve. We're moving beyond the point of productive efficiency and we're moving up the ATC curve. Costs are rising due to problems with communication, motivation of staff, coordination of business activities, etc. The firm has become too large to manage and subsequently control. So costs are rising. It's becoming more difficult for firms to communicate. There's a large number of departments. Maybe there's a very tall organizational structure. There's communication difficulties that are coming from top down. Maybe staff feel isolated and therefore morale can be quite low. Maybe there is the method of production. You could look at specialization division of labor. Staff are bored in their work. There's that much going on. The organization is so large, it's very difficult to coordinate those activities. As a consequence, consumers suffer from higher prices and lower consumer surplus than if the monopolist was smaller and benefiting from lower average costs. Okay, so if they were slightly smaller but experiencing economies of scale would be better. So you've done your essay, you're in the last 10 minutes. The exam is just about to finish, or your essay is just about to finish. You've got that all important, that final evaluation, that final conclusion. Overall, what do we believe in? What do we think? Normally, overall, we would say that monopolies, they are beneficial and they have many pros of their existence. Monopolies are able, particularly publicly owned monopolies, are able to provide us as society with often essential goods and services that if it was left to competitive markets, they may not be as effective than by operating simply as one large organization. So whilst monopolies have their benefit, the main one being dynamic efficiency and economies of scale, we have to be very careful here. There is a risk that they will exploit their customers or abuse their monopoly power. Monopolies, so growing monopoly power is good. However, it could get to a stage where they exploit consumers and there's a risk that they may exploit the ability to set prices. Monopolies can be dynamically efficient in the short run. However, in the long run, due to the lack of competition, They are likely to become inefficient organizations. They are likely to exploit their monopoly power for the interest of profit-seeking shareholders. So the long-term objective of the monopoly will be to profit maximize, and that comes at the expense of consumer sovereignty. It depends on, though, the objective of the firms. Not all monopolies will have the objective of profit maximization, particularly if you look at government-owned monopolies. They are run by the public sector. They are run for the sake of society, and therefore their objectives may actually be more that of allocative efficiency if the company is acting in the public interest. It depends upon the type of monopoly. For example, you have to question, is it a pure monopoly? If it is, there's greater risk of there being abuse of their monopoly power. It could be a situation where you've got growing monopoly power, but there is more than one or two firms in the industry. Look at car manufacturing, for example. They possess monopoly power, but there is a range of different car manufacturers. There's a range of different car brands than you can have. But some of them, because of the large size of them and the smaller number of monopoly firms, they do possess greater levels of monopoly power. So a pure monopoly will abuse its power more than a monopoly that is literally just scraping legal monopoly status of 25% of the market. Remember what I said before, if you own 25% of the market, you don't own 75% of it. What about the natural monopoly argument? We look at, for example, Thames Water. It makes sense for there to be only one monopoly. So in some cases, it depends upon the type of the industry and the nature of the product that we're looking at. And again, look very carefully at your questions to see what type of market you're looking at. What is the product? Is it one that is integral to the running of society? Think of your water utilities. Water is a necessity. It is essential for human survival. What about the opportunity cost? Is there a conflict of objectives? If the firm increases or if the firm pursues profit maximization, they will have to forego being productively efficient. They will have to forego being allocatively efficient. You need to draw the conclusion of, in your opinion, what objective do you think the firm should be aiming towards? What is your overall recommendation? Overall, put it this way, monopolies are here to stay. And in today's society, in today's economy, we actually see growing numbers of monopolies, or certainly monopolies gaining larger monopoly status and monopoly power. Therefore, if monopolies are here to stay, and they do exist, but we are well aware that they are exploiting their monopoly power and abusing their customers, well, what do? We would recommend that monopolies need some form of regulation from the government, notably through the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority. They need regulation from the CMA to prevent their exploitation of consumers. Effective regulation, and you could recommend things like price controls, quality measures, or forced reinvestment, will ensure that the public interest is protected and outcomes are closer to being that of an allocatively efficient firm. Governments should intervene to make the market more contestable, increasing the degree of competition. So through the work of the CMA, they could look at things like preventing mergers, preventing companies from merging. We look at Asda and Sainsbury's, they were prevented from merging because that would basically monopolize the grocery industry. What about looking at deregulation, reducing the red tape in the industry to try and encourage new firms into the industry by therefore lowering the barriers to entry, for example. Okay. Hopefully you find this revision useful, and I wish you every success if you're answering an essay question on monopoly.